Hey guys, tonight we are climbing the gangplank of an 18th century Royal Navy warship, and I promise you, before the first cannon has even been loaded, before the first storm has rolled in off the Atlantic, before you have eaten your first weevil, and yes, that is a sentence I just said with complete seriousness, you are already wondering how fast you can swim back to shore. Tonight's story is the kind that makes your own bed feel like a five-star hotel, your own pillow feel like something designed by angels, and your own dinner, whatever it was, feel like a Michelin-starred masterpiece. We are going back to the 1700s, to the creaking, groaning, salt-soaked world of the Royal Navy at the height of its power, and we are asking one very simple question. Would you last a single day? Spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't make it past breakfast. And I use the word breakfast very, very loosely. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you are watching from tonight, and what time it is where you are. There is something genuinely wonderful about knowing that someone in Auckland and someone in Aberdeen are both drifting off to the sound of 18th century nautical misery at the exact same moment. We are all in this together, just with considerably better sleeping arrangements than the men we are about to meet. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture it. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 1700s. Britain is, as it frequently was during this period, at war with somebody. It might be France. It might be Spain. It might be both simultaneously, which was something of a hobby for the era. The Royal Navy is the most powerful maritime force on the planet, a vast floating empire of oak and canvas and iron, and somewhere in the chaos of Portsmouth Harbor, you are standing on a dock that smells aggressively of fish, tar, unwashed humanity, and something else you cannot quite identify but that you are fairly certain is not pleasant. The harbor is thunderous with noise. Ropes are being hauled, barrels are being rolled, men are shouting in at least 3 languages, and somewhere nearby a pig is expressing its objections to its current situation at considerable volume. You have, for reasons that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time, perhaps you were drunk, perhaps you were broke, perhaps a press gang made the decision for you in a dark alley the previous evening, ended up in the Royal Navy. Congratulations. Try not to die. The ship in front of you is enormous, and your first feeling is something close to awe. It towers above the dock in a way that seems almost architectural, its 3 masts reaching up into a gray English sky, its hull painted in alternating black and yellow bands that will, once you learn what you are looking at, tell you something about the number of gun decks it carries. This is a ship of the line, a third-rate by classification, carrying somewhere between 60 and 80 cannon, crewed by somewhere between 500 and 600 men, and built from the timber of somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 oak trees. That last figure is one historians find genuinely staggering. A single large warship consumed a forest. Entire landscapes were felled and shaped and caulked and tarred into this thing bobbing in front of you, and it is simultaneously one of the most impressive and terrifying objects you have ever seen in your life. You are escorted aboard by a petty officer who has the look of a man who has seen everything and been impressed by none of it. He is weathered in the way that only decades of salt air and sun and hardship can weather a person. His hands like old leather. His eyes permanently narrowed against a wind that is not currently blowing. He looks at you the way a carpenter looks at a warped plank, with professional disappointment. You are, to him, raw material, not a person yet, exactly more of a problem waiting to be shaped into something useful. He says something to you in a clipped accent that you cannot fully parse, something that might be a welcome or might be an instruction or might be a warning, and then he moves on, and you are left standing on the deck of a Royal Navy warship in the mid-18th century, which is, statistically speaking, one of the more dangerous places a human being could choose to be. The deck itself is the first shock. You expected something flat, something stable, something that felt at least vaguely like standing on solid ground. What you get is a surface that is slightly curved. The deck has a gentle convex arch called a camber, designed to let rainwater run off the sides, and it is covered in a texture that is entirely unlike anything you have walked on before. It has been holystoned, which is exactly what it sounds like, scrubbed with large sandstone blocks until it is pale and slightly rough underfoot, and then it has absorbed years of tar and rope fiber and sea spray and the general biological residue of hundreds of men living in very close proximity. It is not slippery exactly, but it is also not quite solid. It moves. The whole ship breathes and shifts even here in the harbor. A gentle, constant, completely unpredictable motion that your body does not yet know how to accommodate. Your inner ear is already having a quiet crisis, and you have not even left the dock. Around you, the ship is a hive of purposeful, bewildering activity. Men move with the automatic confidence of people who know exactly where they are going and exactly what they are doing, which makes you, standing motionless in their midst, feel approximately as useful as a decorative feature. Lines, never ropes. You will learn very quickly that calling them ropes is a social error of the first order aboard a naval vessel, are being coiled and stowed with a precision that borders on the obsessive. Cannon are being checked, their carriages inspected, their touch holes examined. Below your feet you can hear the deep, oceanic sounds of a ship's interior. The groan of timber, the slosh of bilge water, the distant thud of something heavy being moved in the hold. The whole vessel is alive in a way that feels almost organic and not entirely friendly. The smell is something you are going to need to address, because no account of life aboard an 18th century warship is honest without it. The smell is extraordinary. It is layered in a way that suggests geological time. There are strata of odor here that have been accumulating since the ship was first launched. There is the sharp, chemical tang of tar and pitch, used everywhere to seal and waterproof the wood. There is the heavy, almost sweet smell of the bilges, where seawater and organic matter collect in the lowest part of the hull and ferment, slowly, in the dark. There is the smell of wet rope, which is surprisingly unpleasant in large quantities. There is the smell of gunpowder residue, faint but persistent, soaked into the very grain of the wood around the gun ports. And underneath all of it, threading through everything like a bass note, there is the smell of several hundred human beings in a closed space with limited access to fresh water and absolutely no access to anything resembling modern sanitation. You are going to get used to it, your colleagues will assure you. They are, to be direct with you, lying. The ship's company is a sociological study all by itself. The Royal Navy of the mid-18th century was, in its own strange way, one of the most diverse workforces in the British world. Your fellow sailors come from across the British Isles, certainly, but also from across the Atlantic, from the Caribbean, from West Africa, from Scandinavia, from the Mediterranean. There are men here who have been at sea since they were 12 years old, who cannot imagine any other life, who are as comfortable 200 feet above the deck on a storm-tossed yard as you are sitting in your own living room. And then there are men like you, new, bewildered, landlubbers in the truest sense of the word, deposited aboard by circumstance or desperation or the enthusiastic attention of a press gang, trying very hard to look like they know what a sheet is and failing completely. The press gang, since we have mentioned it, deserves a moment. The Royal Navy of this period had a chronic and permanent problem. It needed enormous numbers of men to crew its ships, and not nearly enough men were volunteering. The solution, one that historians still argue was more systematic and legally ambiguous than it was outright illegal, though the distinction felt somewhat academic if you were on the receiving end of it, was impressment. Press gangs, groups of naval officers and sailors authorized to forcibly recruit men with seafaring experience, operated in coastal towns and port cities across Britain. They could legally impress any man who was a British subject and had experience of the sea, though in practice the definition of seafaring experience stretched and contracted according to need, and the line between recruitment and kidnapping was sometimes vanishingly thin. If you were walking home from a tavern in Portsmouth in 1743, and you had ever so much as looked at the ocean with professional interest, you might wake up the next morning in a hammock 14 feet below the waterline with a Royal Navy ship already clearing the harbor. You were not pressed, let us say. You volunteered. Perhaps you needed the pay. A sailor's wages in this period, while not generous, were at least guaranteed, which was more than could be said for many occupations ashore. Perhaps you were genuinely drawn to the sea, to the romance of it, to the stories you had heard about distant ports and naval glory and the brotherhood of the service. Standing here on the deck with tar on your shoes and your stomach already slightly uneasy, the romance is looking a little threadbare, but it is not entirely gone. There is something undeniably magnificent about this ship, about the sheer engineered ambition of it. It is a floating fortress, a city in miniature, a machine of war so complex that operating it requires the coordinated effort of hundreds of specialized human beings, each doing their specific job at precisely the right moment, in conditions ranging from mildly inconvenient to genuinely apocalyptic. You are assigned to a mess, a group of 8 men who will eat together, sleep near each other, and form the basic social unit of your life aboard ship. Your messmates will look you over with the practiced assessment of men who know exactly how much your competence, or lack of it, affects their own survival. One of them, a man with a beard that has its own ecosystem and an expression of permanent mild amusement, tells you that the first thing you need to learn is the difference between a starboard and a larboard watch, and that the second thing you need to learn is never to call it larboard again because they changed it to port in 1844, which is, of course, about a century in your future, so larboard it is. He says this with the tone of a man delivering important intelligence, and then he moves on to explain the watch system in terms that make your head swim, not unpleasantly, in a way that suggests the next 8 hours are going to be educational in directions you had not anticipated. The sun is beginning to lower over the harbor. The pilot is aboard. Somewhere forward, an anchor is being raised by the brute force of men walking in circles around a capstan, singing a rhythm to keep their efforts synchronized. A sea shanty, though the men themselves do not call it that, they simply call it a working song, and it has a low, rolling, hypnotic quality that you will hear in your sleep for months. The sails, an acreage of canvas that you cannot quite comprehend from this angle, are being unfurled from their yards by tiny figures moving along the horizontal spars with an ease that seems physically impossible from down here. The ship is coming alive around you, transforming from a docked object into something with intent, something with direction, something that is, quite unmistakably, about to go to sea. And you, standing on the main deck in clothes that are already wrong for this environment, with hands that have never hauled a line and feet that have never found their sea legs, are going with it. The dock is pulling away, or you are pulling away from the dock. The perspective is confusing and will remain so, and the smell of the harbor is being replaced by something cleaner and colder and enormous, the smell of open water, the smell of the Atlantic, which is out there beyond the harbor mouth, waiting with the infinite patience of something that has been here since long before ships existed and will be here long after the last one has sunk. You watch Portsmouth shrink behind you. You watch the familiar world of solid ground and stationary objects and people who are not about to spend months at sea recede to a thin line on the horizon, and then to nothing. And the ship moves on, and the ocean opens around you in every direction, and it is beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and the petty officer who welcomed you aboard appears at your shoulder and says something about your first watch, and your new life, whether you wanted it or not, has officially begun. The sun has fully set by the time you are shown below decks for the first time, and the transition from the open air of the main deck to the interior of the ship is so abrupt, so total, that your body takes a moment to process what has just happened to it. One moment you were standing under a darkening sky with the wind off the water and the smell of the open sea, and the next you are ducking through a low hatchway into a world that seems to operate by entirely different physical laws. The headroom down here is approximately 5 feet 6 inches on a good day, and that is not a figure chosen for dramatic effect. That is the actual documented vertical clearance between the deck beams on the lower gun deck of a typical third-rate ship of the line in this period. And if you are taller than that, which a surprising number of modern people are, you are going to spend the next several months in a permanent, involuntary bow that will do things to your spine that no physiotherapist in 2024 would believe. You learn this the hard way, immediately, by introducing your forehead to a deck beam with a crack that makes 2 nearby sailors wince in sympathy. Welcome to Below Decks. Mind your head. You will be told this approximately 40 times in the next 24 hours, and it will stop being useful advice roughly 40 times in the next 24 hours. The darkness is the second shock. You knew it would be dark, of course you knew. There are no windows down here in any meaningful sense, just gun ports that are currently closed against the sea, and the light that penetrates from above comes through hatchways and gratings in thin, gray, insufficient columns that illuminate approximately nothing. But knowing something will be dark and actually standing in that darkness are 2 completely different experiences. The lower decks of an 18th century warship at night are dark in a way that feels almost physical, a darkness with texture and weight, broken only by the small, wavering flames of tallow candles in lanterns that are hung at careful intervals and that provide just enough light to see the vague shapes of things without providing nearly enough light to see them clearly. The candles smell of animal fat and hot metal, a smell that will become so familiar to you in the coming weeks that you will stop noticing it entirely. And then one day ashore you will catch a whiff of something similar and it will hit you with the full weight of memory. Your hammock is your home now. That sentence needs to sit for a moment because it is asking quite a lot. A hammock, a rectangle of canvas approximately 6 feet long and 2 feet wide when occupied, slung between 2 hooks in the deck beams, is going to be your bed, your personal space, your retreat, and your only guaranteed private territory for the duration of this voyage. In theory, regulations in this period specified that each man was entitled to 14 inches of width in the hammock row. 14 inches. That is roughly the width of a standard sheet of paper, which will give you a precise and somewhat distressing sense of the personal space allocation aboard a Royal Navy warship. In practice, hammocks were slung so close together that sleeping men were separated from their neighbors by essentially nothing, their canvases touching, their breathing audible, their nighttime movements comprehensively shared with everyone within a 3-foot radius. The hammock rows on the lower gun deck stretch away from you in both directions in the lantern light, dozens of occupied cocoons swaying gently with the motion of the ship, the occupants either already asleep or doing a very convincing impression of it. The men off watch sleep with the absolute, boneless commitment of people who have learned to extract every possible minute of unconsciousness from whatever time they are given, and they sleep through noise and motion that would keep you awake for hours. A nearby cannon, lashed to its port, groans in its tackle as the ship rolls. Somewhere in the darkness, a man is snoring with a commitment that suggests a structural defect. The ship itself provides a constant, shifting chorus of sounds. The creak of timber, the hiss of water against the hull just inches from your ear, the low rumble of the ocean beneath you, and periodically a deep, resonant groan from somewhere in the ship's bones that sounds alarming until you realize that every sailor around you has not so much as twitched, and that this is apparently just the ship expressing itself. Getting into the hammock is its own adventure. It looks straightforward. It is not straightforward. The hammock, unoccupied, presents a narrow opening that wants to twist away from you, and your first several attempts to get into it will result in outcomes ranging from undignified to genuinely comedic, all of it observed by your messmates with the quiet appreciation of an audience that has been through this exact initiation and is now delighted to watch someone else experience it. The trick, once you are told it, is to sit on the edge, lean back, and swing your legs up in one smooth motion, and then to absolutely not panic when the whole thing rotates slightly and you feel briefly like you are about to be tipped onto the deck. You will not be tipped onto the deck. Probably. The hammock, once you are in it, cocoons around you with a snugness that is actually not unpleasant. There is something almost womb-like about it, something that the gentle rocking of the ship reinforces in a way that is, on your first night at least, surprisingly conducive to sleep. Historians still argue whether the hammock, introduced to the Royal Navy in the late 16th century after European explorers encountered them in use among indigenous Caribbean peoples, was adopted primarily for its space-saving properties or because it genuinely provided a better night's sleep in rough seas than a fixed bunk would. The argument being that the hammock suspension allows it to remain relatively stable even as the ship moves beneath it, acting as a kind of biological gimbal. What is not disputed is that the Royal Navy took to them with considerable enthusiasm, and that by the 1700s, a sailor's hammock was as much a part of his identity as his name. When he died aboard ship, which happened with uncomfortable frequency, his hammock served one final purpose, being used as part of his burial shroud, sewn around his body along with a cannonball at his feet for weight, before being committed to the deep. This is a fact you are absolutely not going to think about right now as you lie in yours because you would like to sleep. The temperature below decks is something that fluctuates in ways you will not fully appreciate until you have experienced a few weeks of it. Right now, in this imagined mid-century voyage, it is merely stuffy. The collective body heat of several hundred men in an enclosed space creates an interior climate that is warmer than the night air above, which is something, but the warmth is thick and heavy and carries with it the concentrated atmospheric output of all those bodies. Ventilation on these ships was a constant problem and a constant source of improvisation. Windsails, canvas tubes rigged above deck to funnel air down through the hatchways, helped when there was wind to funnel, but when the ship was becalmed or running before the wind in a way that neutralized them, the air below decks could become extraordinary in its density. Surgeons of the period wrote about this with barely contained horror, noting that the atmosphere between decks was actively detrimental to health, which, as we will get into considerably more later, is the kind of understatement that deserves some kind of award. Your 14 inches of hammock space represents the entirety of your personal territory, but beneath it, in a small wooden box that slides under the area where you sleep, is everything you own aboard this ship. The Admiralty had regulations about what a man could bring aboard, and the regulations were, to put it charitably, austere. Your slop clothing, the standard issue garments provided by the Navy Board and deducted from your pay, consists of a couple of canvas jackets, some trousers, a waistcoat, a few rough shirts, and a knitted wool cap. You have a knife because everyone has a knife being the 18th century equivalent of a multi-tool in terms of daily practical necessity. You may have a small Bible or prayer book if you are that way inclined, and a tin or small box for tobacco if you are that way inclined, which statistically you almost certainly are, since tobacco use among sailors in this period was essentially universal and a pipe in the evening was one of the few genuine pleasures available to you. That is more or less it. That is your life, condensed into a wooden box 14 inches wide. The social geography of the lower deck is more complex than it first appears. This is not simply a dormitory, it is a community, with its own customs and hierarchies and unofficial rules that are as binding as any regulation in the Articles of War, and considerably more immediately enforced. The mess system means that you eat, socialize, and are held informally accountable within your group of 8, and the dynamics of that small group will come to matter enormously to your daily experience. A good mess with compatible messmates can make life below decks almost bearable. A bad mess, one with a bully, a thief, or simply too many men with clashing personalities packed too closely together, can make it genuinely miserable in ways that the official hierarchy will not help you with, because the official hierarchy has rather larger problems to worry about than interpersonal tensions at mess table 6. There is a quirky footnote to the social life of the lower deck that involves something called the gunroom and the wardroom and the considerable distance, both physical and social, between them and the lower deck. The commissioned officers, lieutenants, the master, the surgeon, the purser, live aft in the wardroom, which is by the standards of the lower deck an almost inconceivable luxury, individual cabins, however small, a shared dining table, and a quality of daily life separated from the men forward by what might as well be a different civilization. The captain lives in even greater splendor in his great cabin at the stern, with windows looking out over the ship's wake and furniture that actually belongs to him, not the Navy Board. The physical distance between the captain's cabin and your hammock on the lower gun deck is perhaps 150 feet. The social distance is approximately the distance between the sun and a particularly cold asteroid. You will address commissioned officers as Sir at all times, and you will not address the captain at all unless he addresses you first, a custom that is less a rule and more an expression of the cosmological order of the ship. A quirky detail that tends to surprise people is that the lower deck, for all its hardships, had its own genuine culture of entertainment. Music was actively encouraged by naval authorities because it had been noticed, with the pragmatic wisdom of men who needed their crews functional, that sailors who were singing were sailors who were not fighting each other or brooding on their grievances. Fiddles were common. Flutes appeared. Dancing, sailors' dances, hornpipes and jigs performed in the limited space between the gun carriages. Happened on pleasant evenings when the watch below had a few hours of leisure. There were card games and dice games, storytelling, and an oral culture of sea stories and tall tales that could stretch an evening watch into something almost companionable. The men you are living with are not broken by their circumstances, at least not most of them, not yet. They are adapted to them, which is a different and considerably more impressive thing. The ship's bell, which you will come to know as the most significant sound in your life, strikes at half-hour intervals through the night. 8 bells marks the end of a watch, and watches are 4 hours long, which means that if you are on the middle watch midnight to 4 in the morning, you will get perhaps 3 to 4 hours of sleep before the bell calls you back to duty. Assuming you were able to fall asleep in the first place, which on your first night is a genuine question. Lie there and listen. The ship talks to itself constantly in the dark, a language of groans and creaks and the rhythmic percussion of water against oak. And there is something in it, if you are tired enough and relaxed enough, that is almost musical. The men around you breathe and shift in their hammocks. The candle lanterns sway. The ship rolls slowly beneath you, a motion that is becoming, gradually, less threatening and more hypnotic. You are deep in the belly of one of the most powerful weapons ever built by human hands to this point in history, surrounded by men from 6 nations who have come together under a flag and a set of regulations to do something that is either heroic or insane depending on your perspective. Moving through dark water toward a destination that may or may not involve cannon fire, disease, storms, and all the other cheerful features of 18th century naval service that we have not even gotten to yet. The deck beam you hit your head on an hour ago is still making its presence felt with a low, steady throb. Your hammock, which you were skeptical of, has turned out to be genuinely not bad. The snoring from 3 hammocks down has reached a frequency that is almost meditative. You close your eyes. The ship breathes. The Atlantic receives you into its enormous dark indifference, and somewhere above your head, on a deck you cannot see, the man on the night watch is scanning the horizon and seeing nothing but stars, more stars than you have ever seen in your life on land. Stars from horizon to horizon in every direction because there is no light for 100 miles in any direction to compete with them, and the ship moves through that immensity with quiet, creaking purpose. It is the middle of the 1700s. You are a sailor now, whether you want it to be or not. And tomorrow, if tomorrow does not feature a storm or an enemy sail or the kind of shipboard emergency that turns a quiet night into a screaming catastrophe, tomorrow you will discover what you are actually supposed to eat. The ship's bell strikes 8, and the lower deck convulses into reluctant life around you with the organic, groaning energy of a creature that does not want to wake up but has absolutely no choice in the matter. Men drop from their hammocks with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this in the dark, in rough seas, while half asleep, hundreds of times, and they move immediately toward their duties with a purposefulness that you, blinking in the dim lantern light with your head still throbbing from last night's encounter with the deck beam, can only attempt to imitate. Your messmates are already moving, and one of them, the bearded one with the expression of permanent amusement, whose name you have learned is something that sounds like Ned but might be Ed, the acoustic environment below decks being what it is, jerks his head toward the forward part of the deck in a gesture that clearly means follow me, and so you follow him, because at this stage of your naval career, following people who seem to know what they are doing is essentially your entire survival strategy. You are going to breakfast, and this is where things get genuinely, historically, impressively bad. The food aboard an 18th century Royal Navy warship was governed by a set of official weekly rations established by the Navy Board, which were designed with a kind of bureaucratic optimism that bore only a passing relationship to what actually arrived in the sailor's mess kit by the time the supply chain, the storage conditions, the corruption of pursers, and the simple passage of time had all taken their toll. On paper, the ration system was not entirely unreasonable for its era. A man was supposed to receive a daily allowance of a pound of ship's biscuit, also known as hardtack, and a gallon of beer. On certain days he received salt beef or salt pork, peas, oatmeal, butter, and cheese. This sounds, if you squint at it from a sufficient historical distance, like something approaching a diet. Do not squint at it. Look at it directly with clear eyes, and what you see is a system that was theoretically adequate and practically catastrophic. Hardtack is where we begin because hardtack is where every meal aboard a Royal Navy warship begins. It is a biscuit in only the most charitable and technically defensible sense of the word. A flat, dense, essentially indestructible square of flour and water, baked until every molecule of moisture has been driven out of it, then baked again for good measure, the result being something with the texture of compressed chalk and the flavor of nothing in particular, a blank, beige, load-bearing unit of caloric delivery that has been designed to survive for months or years in the hold of a ship without going bad. This design requirement was largely met. The biscuit itself, the actual flour and water matrix, does survive. What the designers perhaps did not fully account for was what would be sharing that survival with it. Weevils are small, dark beetles whose larvae are particularly fond of grain products, and the ship's biscuit was, from their perspective, a luxury resort. By the time you are eating your hardtack anywhere beyond the first few weeks of a voyage, the biscuit is almost certainly inhabited. There are a few schools of thought among the crew about how to handle this. One school recommends eating in the dark, on the entirely practical grounds that what you cannot see cannot disturb you. Another recommends tapping the biscuit firmly on the mess table before eating, which encourages the weevil larvae to exit of their own accord. This is considered polite, in a way that tells you everything you need to know about the calibration of standards below decks. A third school, the philosophical school, points out that the larvae are themselves a source of protein and that you are, technically, getting extra nutrition, which is the kind of argument that sounds like satire but was apparently made in complete seriousness by men who had simply made their peace with the situation. Ned, let us commit to Ned, shows you the technique with the table, demonstrating with a biscuit that produces a small, depressing evacuation of tiny pale shapes onto the wood, which he then brushes aside with the casual efficiency of a man sweeping crumbs. You watch this. You process it. You eat your biscuit. You do not look at it too carefully while you do so. This is your first practical lesson in the 18th century naval skill of aggressive pragmatism, which is the art of doing what needs to be done without allowing yourself to think too hard about it, and which will serve you better than almost any other quality you could possess in this environment. The beer deserves its own moment. A gallon of beer per day sounds, from a modern perspective, like something between a fraternity party and a medical concern, but the beer in question was what was called small beer, a low-alcohol brew with roughly the alcoholic content of a modern light beer, sometimes less. It was served not primarily for its recreational properties, but for a grimly practical reason. Freshwater stored in wooden casks aboard a ship in the 18th century went bad. It went bad relatively quickly, turning green and slimy and acquiring a smell that made even the most adaptable sailor hesitant. Beer, with its alcohol content and its acidity, lasted considerably longer. The beer ration was therefore less a daily indulgence and more a hydration strategy, which is a sentence that sounds entirely backwards but is completely accurate. When beer ran low and fresh water was unavailable, which happened, wine or spirits were substituted, and there was a daily rum ration that will get its own discussion in due course. The point is that the Royal Navy of the 1700s kept its men in a state of what you might call gentle, functional, more or less permanent mild inebriation, and considered this a reasonable approach to the problem of keeping 500 men adequately hydrated on a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean. Historians still argue whether the daily grog ration, the diluted rum mixture formalized later in the century, improved or worsened overall crew performance, given that it simultaneously reduced the risk of waterborne illness and introduced a chronic low-grade impairment that affected judgment and reaction time, which, when you are working 50 feet above the deck in a gale, is not an entirely trivial consideration. The salt beef is the next item on your education, and it is educational in the way that a very cold shower is educational, clarifying, unwelcome, and impossible to ignore. Salt beef in the 18th century Royal Navy was beef that had been packed in large quantities of salt and stored in wooden barrels, a preservation method that was effective in the sense that it prevented the meat from rotting in any bacterial sense, but was less effective in the sense that it transformed the beef into something with the color of old leather, the texture of something that has been through considerable hardship, and a salt content so extreme that it had to be soaked in fresh water for hours before cooking to make it even theoretically edible. The soaking was supposed to draw the salt out. It drew some of the salt out. The result was meat that was simultaneously tough, slightly rubbery, and aggressively salty, served in a broth that retained the character of both the barrel and the years it had spent inside it. There is a famous, or at least historically documented practice among sailors of carving the salt beef into decorative objects during their off hours. Buttons, small figurines, novelty items, all carved from salt beef that had been polished to a high sheen, the fat content giving it a gleam not unlike horn or dark wood. This sounds like it cannot possibly be true, and yet it is, and the reason it was possible is that the salt beef was so thoroughly desiccated and processed that it had more in common with a dense, slightly rancid wood than it did with anything you would recognize as meat, and that it held a carved edge with reasonable fidelity. Sailors sold these items, traded them, and sometimes presented them as gifts ashore, which raises questions about the gift recipient's experience that are probably best left unexplored. The cook, every ship had one, and the position was typically given to a man who was no longer fully capable of active deck duty, often due to injury, often a man who had lost a hand or a foot in some previous engagement. Because the Navy's version of occupational health provision was essentially to find you a slightly less dangerous job, produced meals in a galley that was, from a fire safety standpoint, a standing catastrophe waiting to happen. The ship's stove, a large iron structure known as the ship's hearth or the galley range, was the only source of cooked food on the vessel, and it had to serve the culinary needs of 500 to 600 men operating on a staggered meal schedule. The cook was not selected for his culinary talents. He was selected for his availability. The result was a style of cooking that could most charitably be described as functional, producing a perpetual boiled or stewed preparation from whatever ingredients were available, seasoned to the extent that anything was seasoned by the salt that had already done considerable work to the meat in its barrel. The cheese, which appeared on certain days of the week according to the ration schedule, was hard in the way that geological formations are hard, and carried a flavor that was assertive in the manner of something that has been stored in less than ideal conditions for an extended period. The butter was frequently rancid, a condition that was accepted with the same philosophical resignation applied to the weevils. Peas pudding, a thick porridge made from dried split peas, appeared regularly and was actually one of the more reliable elements of the naval diet, providing protein and bulk and a degree of comfort that the salt beef rarely managed. It was bland, certainly, but blandness was at this point a virtue. Blandness meant it was not actively hostile. Fresh food was a memory within days of leaving port, and the hunger for it was physical and constant. Citrus fruit, when it was available, and its availability varied enormously depending on where the ship was operating, the efficiency of its supply chain, and whether anyone in the command structure had absorbed the emerging medical understanding that scurvy, the deficiency disease that killed more sailors than combat in this era, was connected to the absence of fresh food, was treated with something close to reverence. An orange aboard a ship that had been at sea for 8 weeks was not a piece of fruit. It was a medical intervention, a sensory experience, a reminder that the world contained things that were not salt and hardtack and rancid butter. Scurvy itself deserves a moment, because it is one of the great slow-motion horrors of naval history. The disease develops gradually. It takes weeks of vitamin C deficiency before the first symptoms appear, and the early signs are easy to dismiss: fatigue, irritability, a vague feeling of unwellness that could be attributed to any number of things aboard a ship where everyone is tired and nobody is entirely well. Then come the symptoms that cannot be dismissed: the gums that swell and bleed, the old wounds that mysteriously reopen as the body's ability to maintain scar tissue fails, the joint pain so severe that movement becomes agony, the profound exhaustion that goes beyond anything ordinary tiredness can account for. Men died of scurvy in considerable numbers throughout the earlier part of the 18th century, and the tragedy is that the cure was known anecdotally long before it was understood scientifically. Sailors and naval surgeons had noted repeatedly that fresh citrus fruit resolved the symptoms, but the institutional infrastructure to act on this knowledge consistently lagged behind the knowledge itself in ways that cost thousands of lives. The gallon of water you receive for washing purposes is separate from your drinking allocation, and is warm in a way that suggests it has been sitting in a cask in the hold for some time, and is to be used with economy across all personal hygiene applications for the day. This is another sentence that, sitting in your own bathroom with its hot water and its various products and its drain and its basic relationship with the concept of cleanliness, requires a moment to fully absorb. 1 gallon. For everything. The men around you manage this with a practiced efficiency that tells you they have stopped thinking about it, and you understand, not for the first time and not for the last, that adaptation to conditions that seem impossible from the outside is one of the most profound human capabilities, and that the men of the lower deck possessed it in extraordinary measure. You finish your breakfast, such as it was. You have eaten a weevil-adjacent biscuit, a portion of salt beef that required both courage and a complete suspension of aesthetic judgment, some peas pudding that was actually fine, and drunk a pint of small beer that was thin and slightly sour and absolutely the best thing on the table. Your stomach is processing all of this with what you might describe as cautious skepticism. Ned is watching you with that expression of permanent mild amusement, which you are beginning to realize is not amusement at you specifically but is simply his resting orientation toward the universe. A man who has found the whole situation funny enough to smile at without being surprised by any of it anymore. You will eat this way or some variation of it for every day of this voyage. Your body will adapt in ways that are both impressive and faintly depressing. You will stop noticing the weevils. You will develop opinions about which cook's peas pudding is better. You will discover a passionate and previously unsuspected enthusiasm for the days when the supply ship or a captured prize yields something, anything fresh. And when you finally, eventually, get back to shore and someone puts a piece of fresh bread in front of you, soft and warm and smelling of yeast and possibility. You will eat it slowly, with your eyes closed, and you will understand for the first time in your life what it means to be genuinely, unconditionally grateful for a meal. But that is a long way off. Right now, the bell is striking, and Ned is on his feet, and there is work to do. The work never stops. That is the first and most fundamental truth of life aboard an 18th century Royal Navy warship, and it is a truth that reveals itself not in a single dramatic moment but in the slow, cumulative, bone-deep way that all the most important truths reveal themselves, gradually, persistently, and with absolutely no regard for whether you are ready to receive it. You are 4 hours into your first full day, you have eaten your Weevil-adjacent breakfast, and you are already being put to work, and the work is going to continue in rotating shifts at all hours of the day and night for as long as this voyage lasts. There is no weekend. There is no evening off. There is no concept of personal time in any form that your modern self would recognize. There is work, and there is the brief, precious, inadequate intervals between work during which you sleep, and that is the complete and entire structure of your existence aboard this vessel. The watch system is the skeleton on which every other aspect of ship life is hung, and understanding it is non-negotiable. The ship's company is divided into 2 watches, the starboard watch and the larboard watch, and they alternate duty in 4-hour shifts around the clock, every day, without exception, regardless of weather, regardless of battle, regardless of how you personally feel about being woken at midnight to go stand on a wet deck in the North Atlantic. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, which sounds almost reasonable until you do the mathematics and realize that 4 hours off includes eating, maintaining your equipment, performing any personal hygiene that the 1 gallon of water per day allows, and sleeping, which means that actual sleep in any given off-watch period might amount to 3 hours if you are efficient and lucky, considerably less if you are not. The exception is the dog watches, 2 2-hour watches in the late afternoon and early evening, which exist specifically to rotate the schedule so that the same men are not always on the midnight watch, a small mercy that someone in naval administration thought of and deserves acknowledgement for, even if everything else about the system is merciless. Your first assignment is what is called holystoning the deck, which you encountered in passing on your first morning but are now experiencing from the business end, and it is exactly as unpleasant as it sounds and possibly slightly more. The process involves kneeling on the wet deck, and it is always wet. The sea spray and the morning damp ensure that the deck is never truly dry, and scrubbing it with a large block of sandstone that fits in 2 hands, working it back and forth along the grain of the planking while seawater is sluiced across the surface ahead of you. The purpose is to keep the deck pale, clean, and splinter-free, and it achieves this purpose effectively. What it also achieves is the systematic destruction of your knees, which are in contact with wet, rough wood for the entire duration of the process, and your lower back, which is bent at an angle that no ergonomics professional would endorse, and your hands, which are gripping rough stone while being repeatedly wetted with cold salt water. The large holy stones were called Bibles, for reasons that are either to do with their size or their importance or both, and the small ones used for corners and tight spaces were called prayer books, which is the kind of naval humor that tells you something about the culture's relationship with organized religion. You hoist yourself up when the job is done and you look at your hands, which are red and raw and beginning to develop the kinds of calluses that your soft, modern, keyboard and touchscreen hands have never been asked to produce. Every man aboard this ship has hands like this, hardened, scarred, stained with tar and rope fiber into a permanent dark patina that no amount of washing entirely removes. Ned holds his up for your inspection at one point during the morning, turning them over with the equanimity of a craftsman displaying the tools of his trade, and the palms are a landscape of old scars and thick skin and rope burn marks that have healed and been reinflicted so many times they have become topographic features. These are working hands. Your hands, by the end of this voyage, if you survive it, will look something like his. Right now they look like the hands of someone who has just been introduced to manual labor for the first time, which is precisely what they are. The rigging is the next frontier, and it is where the gap between your capabilities and the ship's requirements becomes most acutely, vertically, and wind-blastedly apparent. The rigging of a third-rate ship of the line is a system of such complexity that it has its own entire vocabulary, its own entire science, and its own entire category of specialized human being, the topman, whose job it is to work up there in the highest and most precarious parts of the mast and yard system, and who is selected for this role on the basis of youth, agility, nerve, and a somewhat casual relationship with the concept of self-preservation. Top men were typically young, teenagers and men in their early 20s, because the work required not just physical agility but a psychological comfort with height and exposure that tended to erode with age and experience. The cruel irony being that the more you knew about what could go wrong up there, the less inclined you were to be up there. The masts, 3 of them on a ship of this class, the foremast, mainmast, and mizzenmast, rise to heights of between 100 and 160 feet above the waterline. The mainmast of a large third-rate ship was a column of wood over 100 feet tall and over 3 feet in diameter at its base, itself not a single tree but a composite of several large timbers fished and bound together because no single tree grew tall enough and straight enough to serve alone. And this composite column carried above it a topmast and then a topgallant mast, each one progressively thinner and more flexible, the whole assembly tapering upward into a sky that seems very far away indeed from where you are standing on the deck. From those masts extend the horizontal yards from which the sails hang, and to those yards, to adjust and handle those sails, men must go. Routinely, in all weathers. You are not going up there today, your petty officer informs you, with the resigned air of a man who has seen new recruits attempt the rigging and has developed strong opinions about doing things in the right order. Today you are learning the lines. The standing rigging, the fixed system of ropes and cables that support the masts and hold them in position, and the running rigging, the lines that control the movement of the yards and sails, together comprise several miles of rope in various thicknesses and configurations, and every single one of them has a name, a purpose, and a correct way to be handled, coiled, and stowed. Learning which line does what and where it is belayed is not optional or gradual. It is urgent because when the order comes to brace a yard or ease a sheet or let fly a halyard, you need to be at the right line doing the right thing within seconds, and the difference between getting it right and getting it wrong is measured in terms of torn sails, damaged spars, and on a bad day, men's lives. The sheer quantity of named lines on a large sailing warship of this period runs to the hundreds. There were, by various period accounts, somewhere between 600 and 1,000 distinct pieces of running and standing rigging on a fully rigged ship of the line, which is the kind of number that makes you understand why sailors spent years developing their competence and why even experienced men from merchant vessels had to spend time learning the specific quirks of a Navy ship's rig. You spend your morning being walked along the pin rails and fife rails, the rows of belaying pins where the lines are secured, by a patient, long-suffering able seaman who points at each one and names it and expects you to remember, and you do your best, and your best is not very good, but it is a beginning, and beginnings are what you have. The physical demands of the work are constant and cumulative in a way that your body is not prepared for. Hauling on lines requires a technique as much as brute strength. It is about body weight and leverage and the coordinated pull of a team, the rhythm of heave and step that a group of men can sustain for extended periods, but it also simply requires strength, the kind of sustained, full-body muscular effort that builds over years into the characteristic physical type of the experienced sailor, broad in the shoulders and chest, strong in the arms and hands, with legs that have developed the automatic balancing instincts of a body that has spent years on a moving platform. You do not have any of this yet. You have the body of a landsman with landsman's muscles, landsman's balance, and landsman's hands, and the gap between what you have and what the ship requires is going to be bridged exclusively by effort, repetition, and time, and all 3 of those are going to hurt. Among the most physically demanding regular tasks is working the pumps. Every wooden ship leaked. This was not a malfunction but an accepted characteristic of the technology. The consequence of a hull made of thousands of individual pieces of timber that expanded and contracted with changes in temperature and moisture, and that were held together with iron fastenings that corroded and caulking that shifted and worked loose over time. The bilges, the lowest internal spaces of the ship, collected seawater constantly, and this water had to be pumped out regularly to prevent the ship from riding lower and lower in the water until the pumps could no longer keep pace, at which point you had a serious emergency that tended to resolve itself in one direction only. The ship's pumps were operated by hand, by men working in teams on long pump handles in a motion that was essentially an extended, repetitive, full-body exercise with no redeeming qualities beyond the practical one of keeping you afloat, and they were worked in rotation throughout the day. There is a sentence that appears in various forms in naval journals and log books of this period that goes something like, "A ship is not leaking, she is merely making water," and the distinction between the two was considered important for morale, even if it was not entirely convincing to the men on the pump handles. The afternoon watch brings you to a task that is in some ways the most quintessentially maritime of your day: tarring. The tar that was used throughout the ship for waterproofing rope, sealing seams, protecting metal fittings from corrosion, and approximately 40 other applications was hot, sticky, pungent, and inescapable. It got on your hands and stayed there. It got on your clothes and stayed there. It got in your hair if you had hair of sufficient length to catch it and stayed there. The smell of Stockholm tar, the pine-derived tar that was the primary maritime variety, is one of those smells that is simultaneously unpleasant in large doses and strangely evocative in small ones. The smell that anyone who has spent time around traditional wooden boats will recognize immediately, and that carries with it a freight of association. And if your association is with your current situation, the association is somewhat mixed. The blackening of sailors' hands and necks and collars by tar was so characteristic and universal that it gave rise to the term Jack Tar as a generic name for a common sailor, a term that was in common use throughout this period and carries within it the entire working reality of the lower deck distilled into two words. The evening watch brings a slight easing of the pace, weather permitting, and this is when the social life of the deck becomes more visible. Men cluster in small groups, talking, mending their clothing. The ability to sew was not optional for a sailor, since clothing that was not maintained became unwearable, and unwearable clothing in a North Atlantic winter was a medical problem. Splicing rope ends, whittling, smoking pipes in the carefully designated areas where smoking was permitted, which were limited for the entirely sensible reason that a fire aboard a wooden ship carrying several tons of gunpowder was a category of problem that made all other problems seem minor. The conversations range across everything: home, women, money, food, previous voyages, officers liked and disliked, rumors about the ship's destination, complaints about the cook, opinions about the quality of this month's salt pork versus last month's salt pork, which is the kind of comparative analysis that can only be undertaken by people who have run out of more interesting things to compare. Historians still argue whether the grueling pace of the watch system was the product of genuine operational necessity. A ship required constant manning and maintenance to function safely, or whether it also served a secondary social control function, keeping men too exhausted to cause trouble. A theory that is perhaps too cynical about naval administration, but perhaps not cynical enough. What is documented clearly is that the physical and psychological toll of the watch system was cumulative and serious, that men on extended deployments showed signs of what we might today recognize as chronic sleep deprivation and stress, and that the diseases that swept through ships with such terrible regularity found populations whose immune systems had been pre-weakened by exhaustion. The ship was demanding its price in increments, a little every watch, a little every day, and the men paid it because they had no choice and because the ship would not wait, and the sea would not wait, and the Navy would not wait, and the only thing to do was to keep working. 8 bells again. Your first full day is ending. Your hands ache. Your back aches. Your knees, from the holy stoning, send specific and detailed complaints upward with every movement. You have learned perhaps 30 of the several hundred lines you will eventually need to know, eaten 2 meals that required courage rather than appetite, and discovered that the gap between reading about sailing ships and actually working on one is approximately the same as the gap between reading about climbing Everest and actually climbing Everest. You drop into your hammock with the absolute surrender of a body that has run out of reserves, and you are asleep before you have finished the thought that you were about to have. You are 11 days into the voyage when you make your first real mistake. It is not a catastrophic mistake. You have not fallen from the rigging or mishandled a line during a critical maneuver or done any of the genuinely fatal things that the ship offers as options to the careless. But it is the kind of mistake that, in this environment, in this century, under this command structure, carries consequences that your modern sensibility is entirely unprepared for. You were late to your watch. Not dramatically late, for minutes, perhaps 5, the result of a sleep so deep and complete that the bell did not penetrate it the way it usually does. But late is late on a Royal Navy warship in the 1700s, and the petty officer who noted your absence and is now looking at you with the expression of a man who has all the time in the world and all the authority he needs has made it clear, without raising his voice, that this is a matter that will be addressed. The addressing of it is going to be educational in a direction you had hoped to avoid. The command structure of an 18th century Royal Navy warship was a pyramid so steep it was practically vertical, and at its apex sat the captain with a degree of absolute authority that has very few parallels in modern civilian life. The captain of a ship at sea was not merely the senior officer in a professional hierarchy. He was, for practical purposes, the sole executive, judicial, and in certain circumstances almost priestly authority over every soul aboard, operating under the Articles of War, a document that governed naval conduct with a comprehensiveness and a severity that made even the most draconian modern workplace policy look like a gentle suggestion. The Articles of War were read aloud to the entire ship's company at regular intervals, monthly in many ships, partly to ensure that no man could claim ignorance of them and partly, one suspects, as a kind of ritual reminder of what the universe looked like from the captain's perspective, which was a universe in which there was a correct way to do everything and a punishment attached to every incorrect way. The articles themselves covered everything from cowardice in the face of the enemy, for which the penalty was death, stated with a directness that left no room for interpretation, to sleeping on watch, to theft from a messmate, to insubordination, to the somewhat catch-all provision that allowed punishment for any behavior the captain deemed contrary to good order and naval discipline, which was broad enough to encompass essentially anything a captain wished it to encompass. This flexibility was intentional and was considered a feature rather than a flaw, on the grounds that a captain needed to be able to maintain order in circumstances that no written code could entirely anticipate, which is a reasonable point about the nature of authority at sea, and also a description of a system in which the protections available to an ordinary seaman against an arbitrary or vindictive captain were, to be direct about it, quite limited. Your petty officer, whose name is Grimes and who has been in the Navy for 22 years and has developed the emotional range of a particularly experienced rock, explains to you that your lateness will be reported. This is the formal beginning of a process that has several possible outcomes, and which outcome you receive depends on the severity of the offense, the mood of the officers involved, your general record to this point, and factors of institutional culture that vary from ship to ship and captain to captain in ways that make it genuinely difficult to predict. In a well-run ship with a humane captain, and such captains existed, were valued by their men, and sometimes inspired a loyalty that was almost bewildering in its intensity. A first offense by a new recruit might result in little more than a formal reprimand, a note in the log, and a strong suggestion that it not happen again. In a less well-run ship, or with a less humane captain, the outcome might be rather more physical. Flogging was the primary disciplinary instrument of the 18th century Royal Navy, and while it is easy, from a modern perspective, to regard it with uncomplicated horror, understanding it requires some attempt to place it in its context, even if that context does not make it acceptable in any terms we would apply today. The instrument was the cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords attached to a short handle, and its use was regulated, theoretically, by both the Articles of War and by informal custom, the custom being that a captain could order up to 12 lashes without a court-martial, while anything beyond 12 required a formal hearing. In practice, the line between regulated and unregulated punishment shifted considerably depending on who was holding the authority, and there were captains of this period who used the cat with a frequency and enthusiasm that their own officers found troubling, just as there were captains who used it rarely and with evident reluctance and who believed, correctly, that a crew that was flogged constantly was a crew that was demoralized, resentful, and ultimately less effective. Historians still argue whether the flogging culture of the Royal Navy was more or less severe than contemporary practice in armies and civilian institutions, and the answer seems to be that it varied enormously and that generalizations about naval brutality, while not without foundation, missed the considerable range that existed within the system. The punishment, when it came, was a public event. This was not incidental, the public nature was the point. The entire ship's company was assembled, the drummers beat to quarters, the offender was brought forward, his wrists secured to a grating rigged upright on the deck, his back bared, and the boatswain's mate, a man selected for physical capability rather than sensitivity, administered the strokes while the officers watched and the men watched and everyone present understood, whether they had seen it before or were seeing it for the first time, that this was the boundary being drawn, this was the price of certain choices, this was the system making itself visible and physical and impossible to intellectualize. The captain read the charge and the sentence before it began, in a formal voice, and the surgeon stood by, because the Navy had at least made the practical calculation that a dead or permanently disabled sailor was a less useful sailor, and that there were medical limits beyond which punishment became counterproductive even in its own terms. You receive, for your lateness, a verbal reprimand delivered with the flat, comprehensive disapproval of a man who has given verbal reprimands so many times that he has distilled them to their pure essential form, which is more unpleasant in its way than shouting would be. You are not flogged. You are fortunate. You understand, watching the faces of the men around you during this exchange, that fortune is relative and that the line between a reprimand and something worse is thinner than you would like it to be, and you do not intend to find out where exactly it falls. The hierarchy aboard the ship was not simply about punishment and its avoidance, though those were significant organizing principles. It was a complete social architecture that governed every interaction, every form of address, every spatial arrangement, every privilege and deprivation of daily life. The commissioned officers, the captain, the lieutenants, the master, the surgeon, the purser, existed in a social world that overlapped with the lower deck only in the formal, regulated moments of command and duty. The wardroom, where the commissioned officers ate and lived, was a different civilization. They had tablecloths, they had wine, they had individual crockery that was not tin. The captain's great cabin, at the stern of the ship with its row of windows and its relative spaciousness, was by the standards of the lower deck an almost incomprehensible luxury, and the social distance between you, in your hammock among 500 others, and him, in his cabin with his steward and his furniture, was so vast as to constitute a different experience of being aboard the same vessel. The petty officers, bosuns, gunners, carpenters, their mates, occupied the middle ground of this world, neither officers in the full sense nor ordinary seamen, and theirs was a role of considerable daily power and considerable institutional ambiguity. These were the men who actually ran the ship moment to moment, who translated the officers' orders into physical reality, who knew every line and every man and every quirk of the vessel's behavior, and their relationship with the men below them was complex in ways that a simple power hierarchy does not capture. A good petty officer was worth his weight in experienced labor, was respected rather than merely feared, and could manage the mood of his division in ways that determined whether a difficult watch was merely hard or genuinely dangerous. A bad one was a source of low-grade misery that percolated through the mess tables and the watch bills and the daily rhythms of the ship in ways that were difficult to address and easy to feel. Among the more interesting quirks of the social system aboard ship was the role of the captain's clerk, a position that carried considerably more power than its title might suggest, since the clerk was the man who maintained the ship's books, recorded the muster, tracked the pay accounts, and had access to the administrative machinery through which official life was organized. Clerks were frequently educated men who had ended up at sea through various routes, and they occupied a social position that did not fit neatly into the commissioned officer or petty officer categories, which meant they navigated the ship's social world with a particular kind of practiced flexibility. One quirky historical footnote is that several Royal Navy captains of this period employed their own illegitimate sons as their clerks or servants, a practice that was not officially sanctioned but was widely known and generally tolerated, the ship's company understanding that certain personal arrangements between those with power were simply part of the institutional landscape. Your own relationship with authority aboard this ship is going to be tested in small ways constantly, and the skill you are developing, the skill that every man below decks develops as a matter of survival, is the ability to read the mood of the chain of command above you with enough accuracy to avoid the worst of the consequences that authority can deliver. You learn to read Grimes, to understand that his particular silence means something different from his general silence, that a certain set of his shoulders indicates an inspection coming, that when he whistles to himself while walking the deck it means something in the air is running relatively smoothly, and when he does not whistle at all it means something is wrong and you should look busy with something useful. You learn to read the lieutenants. There are 3 of them on your ship, each with his own temperament and each presiding over his watch with his own style, one a genuine disciplinarian, one a man who prefers to let the petty officers handle the daily management and reserves his authority for moments of real necessity, and one who is young enough and new enough to his commission that he is still figuring out who he is in this role and oscillates between excessive severity and excessive leniency in ways that make him, of the 3, the most difficult to predict. The captain you have seen twice, at the reading of the articles and once on deck during a navigational matter that required his presence, and from both occasions you have formed an impression that is difficult to articulate but important to feel. This man is the ship. Not in the sentimental sense, not in the inspirational poster sense, but in the practical, absolute sense that his personality has shaped the culture of this vessel down to its lowest decks, that his preferences and tolerances and phobias have become the invisible architecture within which everyone else lives. A captain who feared fire held more frequent fire drills, which meant his crew was faster and better at it. A captain who valued gunnery drilled his gun crews relentlessly, which meant his ship could fire faster than the fleet average. A captain who was paranoid about desertion kept shorter shore leave and watched the boats more closely. Whatever the captain valued, the ship expressed, and whatever the captain feared, the ship organized itself against. This was not an efficient system by modern standards of institutional design, but it was a coherent one, and in the peculiar, isolated, self-contained world of a ship at sea, coherence had its own value. You have learned, in these 11 days, to move through the hierarchy with the careful, observant attention of someone who understands that the rules here are real and their consequences physical, and that the margin for error that modern life has accustomed you to, the ability to make a mistake and appeal it, to push back, to request a second opinion, to have recourse to some external authority, essentially does not exist out here. There is the captain, there is the sea, there are the articles of war, and there is you, trying to be useful and visible in the right ways and invisible in the wrong ones, trying to learn fast enough that your ignorance stops being dangerous, trying to sleep in 4-hour increments and eat Weevil biscuits with equanimity and haul on the right line when the order comes. Your hands have already changed. The calluses that were forming in the first days have hardened and thickened into something functional. The rope burn that plagued your first week, settling into a toughened skin that protests less and performs more. Your balance has improved. You notice it suddenly one morning, the way your body has quietly, without consulting you, learned to accommodate the ship's motion, making the constant small adjustments that keep you upright on a moving deck without your conscious attention. Your body is becoming a sailor's body, incrementally, involuntarily, adapting to its environment with the indifferent efficiency of biology responding to demand. Whether your mind is keeping pace is a question you prefer not to examine too closely on the evenings when the homesickness is worst, when the distance between this hammock and everything familiar feels not like miles of ocean but like something more permanent, more geological, harder to cross than any sea. The bell strikes. Grimes does not whistle tonight. You look busy with something useful. The ship's surgeon is a man named Fellows, and you have been doing your very best to avoid his professional attention since the moment you came aboard, on the entirely rational grounds that in the 18th century, requiring the services of a ship's surgeon was an outcome to be postponed as long as possible by any means available. This is not a reflection on Fellows personally, who is, by the standards of his time and profession, a reasonably competent and not entirely callous practitioner. It is a reflection on the state of medicine in the 1700s, which was in that particular historical position of knowing enough to be confident and not knowing nearly enough to be safe. A combination that produced outcomes that would make a modern emergency physician weep quietly into their evidence-based protocols. You have managed 11 days without incident, but this morning you woke with a tooth that is making its unhappiness known with a persistence that cannot be ignored, and one of your messmates, with the cheerful sadism of a man who is not the one with the toothache, has suggested you see Fellows about it. The surgeon's domain was the cockpit, located in the lowest and most forward part of the ship, a space that in battle would become the operating theater and that in peacetime served as the surgery, the dispensary, the consulting room, and the place where the ship's medical stores were kept in a large wooden chest called the surgeon's chest, the contents of which were specified by the Navy Board and which represented the cutting edge of 18th century pharmaceutical knowledge, which is a sentence that should be approached with significant caution. The chest contained, among other things, various herbal preparations whose efficacy ranged from mildly useful to entirely theoretical, several types of purgatives that were prescribed with a frequency that suggested the era believed a significant proportion of all human illness originated in an insufficiently evacuated digestive system, laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol that was one of the few genuinely effective pain management tools available, and which was dispensed with a liberal hand that would horrify modern practitioners, and a collection of surgical instruments that were kept sharp, which was one of the few concessions to what we might recognize as best practice. Fellows examines your tooth with the focused attention of a man who has seen worse, which, in his career, he certainly has. The tooth is infected, a condition that in the 18th century, without antibiotics, without sterile technique, without any of the pharmaceutical arsenal that modern dentistry deploys so casually, was a genuine medical threat rather than merely an unpleasant inconvenience. The treatment options available to Fellows are limited. He can apply oil of cloves to the affected area, which will provide some temporary relief and smells aggressively of Christmas. He can prescribe a laudanum preparation for the pain. Or he can extract the tooth, which will resolve the infection at the cost of the tooth. Using a dental key, an instrument that looks something like a corkscrew crossed with a set of pliers and operates on the general principle of levering the tooth from its socket with enough force to overcome the jaw's objections. You will be given a leather strap to bite down on during this process, not because it will help with the pain in any significant way, but because it will give you something to do with your jaw other than scream, which is considered good form. You opt for the oil of cloves and the laudanum, which is a reasonable short-term decision and a problem deferred rather than solved, but deferring problems is a legitimate survival strategy and one that the lower deck has elevated to an art form. Fellows dispenses both with the brisk efficiency of a man who has a waiting room full of sailors and limited supplies and applies the oil of cloves himself, which stings in a way that briefly makes the tooth seem preferable, and then settles back and looks at you with the assessing eyes of a doctor conducting an unofficial general examination, because that is what good ship's surgeons did. They watched, they catalogued, they noted the early signs of things that had not yet declared themselves, because in the closed ecosystem of a ship at sea, what started in one man could move through the whole company with terrifying speed. What Fellows is watching for, above everything else, above the fevers and the injuries and the dental catastrophes, is scurvy, which we touched on earlier in the context of the food, but which deserves its full horror now that you are far enough from land for it to become a real possibility. You remember the oranges we mentioned, the ones treated with reverence? Here is why. The first signs of scurvy appear perhaps 4 to 6 weeks into a voyage that lacks sufficient fresh food, and they appear first as fatigue so profound it feels qualitatively different from ordinary tiredness, a heaviness in the limbs, a reluctance of the body to do what the mind asks, that goes beyond anything that sleep can fix. Then the gums. Then, in the worst cases, the reopening of old wounds, the body literally unmending itself as its capacity for tissue maintenance collapses at the cellular level. Men who had been wounded in previous engagements and had healed found old scars softening and splitting open as if they were fresh, the body retracing its own history of damage in a way that was, to those who witnessed it without understanding the biochemistry, deeply unnerving. The other great killer aboard, the one that Fellows watches for with particular dread, was typhus, carried by the body lice that were as much a part of ship life as the weevils and the rats and the bilge smell. Typhus, called ship fever in this period, a name that captured its habitat with depressing accuracy, could move through a ship's company with a speed that defied any attempt at containment given the tools available, and the mortality rate in severe outbreaks was staggering. It has been calculated, and the calculation is one of those historical facts that stops you in your tracks, that during the 18th century the Royal Navy lost more men to disease than to enemy action by a ratio that various estimates put it somewhere between 3 to 1 and 6 to 1, depending on the period and the theater of operations. 3 to 6 times as many men died of typhus, scurvy, dysentery, malaria in tropical waters, and yellow fever as died of cannon fire and sword cuts. The enemy was not always the French. More often it was invisible, microscopic, carried in dirty water and lice and the accumulated biological output of hundreds of men in an enclosed space. Dysentery deserves its own particular mention because it was both extremely common and extremely miserable, and the treatment for it was, in the tradition of 18th century medicine, something that a cynical person might describe as making the disease look good by comparison. The standard treatment involved repeated purgatives, substances designed to accelerate the digestive process in ways that the already digestively compromised patient was not well positioned to accommodate, on the theoretical basis that the illness was caused by something that needed to be expelled, which was not entirely wrong in concept but catastrophically wrong in application, since the primary danger of severe dysentery is dehydration and electrolyte loss, and treating it with aggressive purging was the medical equivalent of responding to a house fire by opening all the windows. Fellows knows this is not ideal. Fellows operates within the pharmacological constraints of his century. He does what he can. The rats, which we have been circling around and which can no longer be avoided, are not a background feature of ship life but an active and considerable presence. A large warship in this period might carry anywhere from several hundred to several thousand rats, depending on how long it had been since anyone had made a serious attempt at control, and how thoroughly the hold was stocked with provisions that rats found appealing, which was essentially all provisions. They lived in the hold, in the bilges, in the spaces between the frames, in the rope lockers, and they were bold in the way that animals become bold when they exist in sufficient numbers that individual timidity is no longer an adaptive advantage. They came out at night in particular, moving along the beams and through the lower decks with the confident familiarity of residents rather than pests, and their sounds, the pattering, the gnawing, the occasional territorial dispute in the darkness, were as much a part of the ship's nocturnal soundscape as the creak of timber and the movement of water. The rats gnawed ropes, which was both dangerous and infuriating. They gnawed through provisions, contaminating stores far beyond what they actually consumed. They carried fleas, and the fleas carried illness, and the illness moved from rats to fleas to men in the ancient, relentless cycle that had been running since ships first put to sea. There were ship's cats, which helped at the margins and which occupied a social position in the ship's community that was frankly better than several of the humans, being fed, petted, and maintained with a solicitude that the lower deck rarely directed at its own members. The cats were not adequate to the problem. Nothing was adequate to the problem. The rats were an accepted feature of the environment, like the smell and the darkness and the motion, something to be managed rather than eliminated, worked around rather than solved. A quirky footnote to the rat situation is that some sailors ate them, and not only in extremis. In a diet as monotonous and nutritionally limited as the standard naval ration, a rat represented fresh meat, protein, something that had not spent 6 months in a salt barrel, and there are period accounts of sailors hunting them with something approaching sporting enthusiasm and cooking them in ways that were described by the men who ate them as not bad, a phrase that in context translates approximately to better than you'd think and considerably better than nothing. This is, again, one of those facts that requires a moment to process and that recalibrates your understanding of what the word acceptable meant to the men of the lower deck, whose threshold for acceptable had been systematically adjusted by their circumstances until it occupied coordinates that your own threshold will not approach. Fellows' working day in ordinary circumstances, meaning no battle, no epidemic, no major storm with its attendant injuries, consisted of the morning sick call, at which men who felt unwell presented themselves for examination, and the ongoing management of the chronic conditions that were simply part of the ship's baseline medical reality. Hernias were common, the result of the constant heavy lifting and the physical demands of the work. Ruptures of various kinds, the eye conditions that came from constant exposure to salt spray and wind and the straining to see in poor light. The hearing loss that developed from proximity to cannon fire over years of service, which was not recognized as a medical issue in this period, but which left many long-serving naval men in their later years with a profound and permanent deafness that was considered an unremarkable occupational outcome. Rheumatism, from the constant damp and cold of the lower decks, settled into joints and stayed there, accumulating with years of service into a stiffness that eventually made climbing the rigging impossible and relegated older men to the deck work and the pumps. The medicine chest contained laudanum, as mentioned, and this is worth dwelling on, because laudanum was the one genuinely reliable tool in Fellows' limited arsenal, and he used it accordingly. Opium dissolved in alcohol, it managed pain with an effectiveness that nothing else in the chest could match, and it was prescribed for toothaches and injuries and post-surgical recovery and the anxiety of battle and the misery of certain diseases and, frankly, for the low-grade psychological suffering of men who were simply having a very bad time of things, and for whom something that made the edges of the world softer and the sounds of the ship more distant was both a genuine mercy and the best available option. The dependency risks that modern pharmacology attaches to opioid use were not part of the 18th century medical framework, which meant laudanum was dispensed with a freedom that tells you something important about the priorities of the era. Managing immediate suffering was urgent, and future pharmaceutical dependency was a problem for a future that a great many of these men were not statistically guaranteed to reach. Your tooth has been quieted by the oil of cloves, temporarily, and the laudanum has taken the edge off the remaining discomfort with an efficiency that you find both impressive and slightly alarming. You sit for a moment in the cockpit after Fellows has moved on to his next patient, and you take stock. You are perhaps 2 weeks into a voyage that may last months. You have already accumulated sore hands, an infected tooth, a back that registers every deck scrubbing session with precise anatomical detail, and a collection of minor rope burns and bruises that you have already stopped consciously noticing, which is either adaptation or denial and possibly both. Fellows' patients cycle through around you. A man with a badly infected cut on his forearm, a man whose eyes are red and streaming from salt spray, a man who moves with the careful, deliberate gait of someone whose joints have decided to protest in unison. They all present themselves with the same matter-of-fact stoicism, describe their symptoms with the brevity of men who have learned not to make too much of their own suffering, accept whatever Fellows offers, and return to duty. This, you are beginning to understand, is what endurance looks like at its most fundamental. Not the dramatic, cinematic version. Not the gritted teeth and the stirring music and the moment of triumph, but the quiet, daily, unwitnessed version. The version where you get up when the bell rings even though everything hurts. The version where you eat what is in front of you without looking at it too carefully. The version where you present yourself to the surgeon with a tooth that has been keeping you awake for 3 nights and you describe it to him as a bit sore and you take your oil of cloves and you go back to work. The men around you have been doing this version of endurance for years, some of them for decades, and the fact that they are still standing, still functioning, still capable of the hornpipe and the sea story and the quiet laugh at a messmate's expense, is one of the most genuinely impressive things you have ever witnessed. The tooth will need to come out eventually. You know this. Fellows knows this. Even your tongue, which keeps finding the tooth with the masochistic persistence of tongues everywhere, seems to know this. But not today. Today you have a watch to stand and lines to learn and a ship that will not wait for your dental calendar to align with your courage. 3 weeks out from Portsmouth, the weather changes. It does not change with the dramatic suddenness of the stories you have heard. Not at first. It changes the way a mood changes in a room, gradually and then all at once, in a way that everyone around you seems to sense before you do. Reading signals in the sky and the sea and the behavior of the ship itself that your landlubber's education has not yet equipped you to decode. The barometer, a relatively recent navigational instrument in this period, and one that the more scientifically inclined officers consult with something between professional interest and superstitious reverence, has been dropping since yesterday evening, and the experienced men have been watching the sky with the focused attention of people who know that what happens up there in the next few hours will determine what happens down here in ways that are not entirely within human control. The clouds on the western horizon have a particular texture, a bruised, architectural quality that the old hands read the way you might read a road sign, and what it says is not encouraging. Ned tells you to lash everything down. He says this without drama, in the same tone he might use to tell you breakfast is ready, but there is a quality of economy in the way he says it, an absence of any wasted word or movement that tells you he means it completely. You lash everything down. You watch the other men doing the same around you with a speed and thoroughness that speaks of deep muscle memory, and you try to match their pace and succeed approximately well enough. Loose objects on a ship in a serious storm become projectiles. A tin cup, a tool's chest inadequately secured, a cannon that has worked free of its breechings. In the violent motion of a ship in heavy weather, anything not fixed in place becomes a hazard with mass and velocity and no particular preference about what it hits. This is not a metaphor. This is physics, applied to a wooden box full of people and iron and gunpowder, being thrown around by the North Atlantic, which has opinions and the energy to express them. The wind comes first. It comes from the northwest, initially as an increase in what was already a brisk breeze, and then more purposefully, and then with the kind of commitment that takes it from weather into something that feels more like an assertion. The sails, which had been drawing well and driving the ship at a satisfying pace, become suddenly dangerous. Too much canvas in too much wind is a recipe for a dismasting, for a spar carried away, for a ship pressed so hard onto her side that water comes in through the gun ports and the whole equation of buoyancy changes in directions you do not want it to change. The order comes from the quarterdeck, relayed down through the hierarchy in a cascade of shouted commands that are themselves a marvel of organizational precision, to reef the topsails, and suddenly every topman on the ship is moving upward into rigging that is now moving in ways it does not move in calm weather. You are not a topman. You have made peace with this, a peace that your stomach is currently endorsing with considerable enthusiasm. But you are on deck, hauling on the lines that allow the topmen to do their work, and the deck is not a safe place either. The motion of the ship has changed completely, where before it rolled in a long, relatively predictable rhythm that your body has learned to accommodate, it now pitches and rolls in combinations that are irregular and sudden and sometimes both at once, and the deck rises toward you and falls away from you in sequences that your legs, however well they have been developing their sea instinct, are not always fast enough to anticipate. You hold on. Holding on is the primary skill in heavy weather, the foundation on which all other heavy weather skills are built, and you hold on with the white-knuckled determination of someone who has internalized, at a very basic level, that the sea on either side of the rail is not a survivable destination. The rain arrives with the wind's second act, and it is not the gentle rain of a temperate afternoon but the kind of horizontal, driven rain that feels structural, that has mass and intent, that hits exposed skin like a thrown handful of cold gravel and finds every gap in your clothing with the determination of something that has been doing this for a long time and is very good at it. Your oilskin, a heavy canvas garment treated with linseed oil to provide some degree of water resistance, the 18th century equivalent of a waterproof jacket and about as effective as you might expect, is already saturated in the places where it was always going to saturate, the seams and the cuffs and the collar, and the rain is finding those places and following them inward with a thoroughness that ensures you will spend the rest of this watch cold and wet in a way that penetrates to the bones and stays there long after the rain itself has stopped. This is so standard a condition of heavy weather watchkeeping that the men around you have stopped noticing it. You are working on stopping noticing it. You have not quite got there yet. The real danger of the storm is not the rain or the wind by themselves, though both are serious enough. The real danger is the combination of everything, the motion, the spray, the reduced visibility, the noise that makes communication difficult, the fatigue of men who have already been working hard and are now working harder in worse conditions, and the specific, lethal geometries that these combinations can create. A man working on a yard 100 feet above the deck in a gale, with the ship pitching beneath him and the yard itself moving in arcs that require his full strength and attention just to hold on, is operating at the absolute edge of what human capability can sustain. And the edge is where accidents live. The cry of man overboard in a storm was, in this period, almost universally a death sentence. The ship could not stop. Stopping was not an option in heavy weather in the way that stopping is an option for a car. Turning around took time and sea room that the wind might not provide. The water was cold enough and the waves high enough, and the speed of a man's drift away from the ship fast enough, that rescue was a theoretical possibility that practical reality rarely honored. Historians still argue about the precise mortality rates from falls from rigging versus drowning versus other accidents in the Royal Navy of this period, the records being incomplete and the causes of death sometimes recorded with a generality that makes specific analysis difficult. But the consensus is clear that the sea itself, in its various violent expressions, was a constant and significant source of casualties entirely separate from any enemy action. The ship was not trying to kill you in any intentional sense, but it was an environment in which the margin for error was thin and the consequences of errors were disproportionate, and the storm made that margin thinner still. The ship herself is responding to the storm with the behavior of a large, complex, semi-living system being stressed toward its tolerances. She groans, not metaphorically but literally, the timber structure of the hull flexing under the forces being applied to it, the frames and planking and knees working against each other in ways that are entirely normal and entirely alarming to a new ear. A wooden ship is not rigid. It is designed to flex, to work with the sea rather than resist it absolutely, and the sounds this produces in heavy weather are a low, oceanic vocabulary of creaks and pops and the deep, resonant complaint of large pieces of oak being asked to do exactly what they were built to do but doing it loudly. The experienced men do not hear these sounds as alarming. You hear them as alarming. You will get there. The pumps are working harder. The ship is making more water in heavy weather as the hull works and the caulking between the planks opens and closes fractionally with each flex, allowing more ingress than calm weather sailing would produce, and the men on the pump handles are working in rotation with grim efficiency, Because the pump stopping is not an option and the sea does not care about your schedule or your back or the fact that you have already been on deck for 3 hours in horizontal rain. You take your turn on the pump handles when the rotation comes to you, and you pump with the single-minded focus of a person who has understood at a fundamental level what the pumps are for and what stops happening if they stop. And this understanding gives your arms a motivation that transcends ordinary fatigue. Fire was the other existential threat aboard a wooden warship, and the storm, counterintuitively, did not eliminate it. Lightning was a real danger. A ship's masts were tall metal-tipped wooden columns presenting themselves to the sky in exactly the way that would concern a modern lightning safety expert, and a strike could start a fire in the rigging or, in the worst case, could travel down the mast into the magazine, the room deep in the ship's interior where the gunpowder was stored, and produce an outcome that ended the ship's existence almost instantaneously. The copper lightning conductors that Benjamin Franklin had recommended and that some forward-thinking naval officers had begun installing were not yet universal in the mid-18th century, and there were ships that went through their entire service life without them and were lucky, and ships that were not lucky, and the difference between them was the weather's indifference and nothing more. The magazine deserves a specific mention because it was the ship's most carefully managed space, the place where the interaction between fire and function was most acute and most controlled. The powder room was located deep in the ship, below the waterline if possible, surrounded by thick wooden walls and accessed through a series of hatches designed to contain any accidental ignition. The men who worked in the magazine during action war felt slippers specifically to prevent sparks from metal against metal. The lanterns that illuminated it were sealed behind glass panels in the magazine walls, with no direct flame ever permitted inside. The gunpowder itself was stored in barrels and in cartridge cases, the latter being flannel bags pre-filled with measured charges that were carried up to the guns during action by powder monkeys, boys, some as young as 10 or 11, who ran the cartridges from the magazine to the gun crews through the chaos and smoke of battle. A detail about child labor and combat exposure that the 18th century accepted without apparent discomfort and that we encounter now with the complex feelings it deserves. The storm peaks sometime in the middle of the night, which is the kind of scheduling that weather has no interest in reconsidering. You are on watch during the worst of it, which means you are on deck in the darkness with the rain and the spray and the noise and the motion, doing what you are told, holding on, hauling when hauling is required, watching the men around you for cues about what is happening and what response is appropriate. The darkness in a storm at sea is a particular kind of darkness. Not the peaceful dark of below decks, but an active, dynamic dark full of motion and sound and the white of breaking wave crests that appear suddenly and vanish, and the ship's lanterns guttering in the wind and throwing uneven light across a deck that is never in the same position for more than a second at a time. There is a moment somewhere in the middle watch when you are gripping a stay, one of the fixed rigging lines that support the mast, with both hands and your face is turned away from the weather and the ship lifts suddenly beneath you in a way that takes your stomach somewhere your body has not followed, and you have a moment of perfect clarity about the reality of your situation that is simultaneously terrifying and oddly calming. You are on a wooden ship in the North Atlantic in the middle of the 18th century, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the night, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about any of those facts. And your survival depends entirely on the quality of the oak around you and the skill of the men beside you and the fickle, massive, indifferent judgment of the sea. You cannot control any of it. You can only hold on and do your job and trust the ship and trust the men and wait. The waiting is its own skill. Ned, lashed to a nearby pin rail with a practiced efficiency that you have tried to emulate, is waiting with the patience of a rock formation. He has been through storms before, many of them worse than this in waters less forgiving than these, and he has developed what you can only describe as a professional relationship with the fear, an accommodation with it that does not eliminate it but renders it manageable, containable, something that exists alongside the work rather than overwhelming it. You watch him and you try to borrow some of his steadiness by proximity, the way you might try to warm your hands at someone else's fire. The storm begins to ease toward dawn, incrementally, the way it built. The wind dropping in stages, the rain thinning, the motion of the ship settling from its violent irregular pitching into something more rhythmic and manageable. The gray light that comes with the early morning reveals a deck that has been thoroughly rearranged by the night's weather, spars shifted, lines chafed. the surface itself scoured clean by the rain and spray, and the men coming off watch move below with the particular exhausted silence of people who have been through something and have not yet decided how to feel about it. You go with them. The hammock receives you. The ship, still moving but no longer threatening, breathes around you. You have survived your first serious storm. It was not the worst the Atlantic can offer, not even close, as Ned will cheerfully inform you when you wake, describing with evident relish a storm in the Bay of Biscay in 1741 that makes last night sound like a brisk afternoon. But it was enough. It was enough to teach you that the sea is not a backdrop to the story of this voyage but the story itself, the constant, overwhelming, non-negotiable context within which every other thing happens, and that the men who live on it do not conquer it or master it in any meaningful sense but simply, persistently, stubbornly refuse to be defeated by it, one watch at a time. The drum beats to quarters at 6 in the morning, and the sound of it does something to the air aboard the ship that no previous sound has done. It changes the texture of everything, the way a single unexpected chord changes the emotional register of a piece of music. And the men around you are moving before the last beat has finished with a speed and purposefulness that is qualitatively different from any other movement you have witnessed in your weeks aboard. This is not the purposeful movement of men going to their daily work. This is the movement of men who have trained for something specific and are now doing it, and the difference is palpable in a way that tightens your chest and focuses your attention with an animal clarity that you did not know you possessed until this exact moment. There is a sail on the horizon. It is not one of ours. The clearing for action is a transformation so total and so rapid that it seems almost impossible, and yet it is accomplished with the systematic efficiency of a drill performed hundreds of times until it has become automatic. The ship dismantling its domestic identity and reassembling itself as a weapon in a process that takes, in a well-trained crew, somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes. The cabins that the officers inhabit, the wooden partition walls that divide the lower decks into semi-private spaces, are knocked apart and stowed, the furniture struck below or thrown overboard if necessary. The spaces opened into a continuous fighting deck clear from bow to stern with nothing to impede the movement of men and ammunition and the recoil of cannon. The cooking fire in the galley is extinguished, fire control during battle being the kind of priority that concentrates even the most distracted mind, and the cook, whose operational role shifts from feeding the ship to managing the damage control apparatus, begins organizing his buckets and his sand and his fire pumps with the grim efficiency of a man who knows exactly what a shipboard fire during a battle means and would prefer to prevent it. The guns are the heart of it. Your ship carries 74 guns arranged in 2 main gun decks and an upper deck, and each gun is served by a crew of between 8 and 14 men depending on its size, organized into a hierarchy of function. The gun captain who commands the piece, the sponger who cleans the barrel between shots, the loader who rams the charge and shot home, the men on the train tackles who run the gun back into firing position after recoil, the powder monkey who sprints back and forth from the magazine with the flannel cartridges, doing a job that combines the physical demands of a sprint relay with the psychological demands of running through a burning building repeatedly while people shoot at you. You have been assigned to a gun crew on the lower gun deck, one of the 26-pounder long guns, the heavy artillery of the ship, weapons that weigh somewhere between 2 and 3 tons apiece and that fire a cast iron ball the size of a large grapefruit with enough force to penetrate 2 feet of solid oak at close range. The gun itself, up close and in preparation for use, is a different object from the gun lashed to its port in peacetime. It has been cast loose from its sea lashings. The port lid has been opened to admit the gray morning light and a rectangle of cold sea air, and the crew around you moves through the preparation sequence with a choreographic precision that leaves no room for hesitation or improvisation. The cartridge goes in first, rammed home to the breech end of the barrel with the rammer, a long wooden pole with a cylindrical head. Then the wad, a tight disc of rope fiber that holds the charge in place. Then the shot. Then another wad to keep the shot from rolling out when the gun is depressed. The gun captain pricks the cartridge through the touch hole with a long wire pick, pours a measure of fine powder into the pan, cocks the flintlock firing mechanism, and the gun is ready. This entire process, in a well-drilled crew under battle conditions, takes somewhere between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. The fastest crews in the Navy could fire 3 rounds in 5 minutes. a rate of fire that was considered an extraordinary tactical advantage, and that the Royal Navy trained toward with a seriousness of purpose that set it apart from many of its opponents. You are not, to be direct about it, a well-drilled crew member in any meaningful sense. You have been at sea for 3 weeks, and your gun drill has consisted of several practice sessions that you found confusing and loud, and that left you with a general understanding of the sequence and a specific uncertainty about your exact role in the faster, more pressured version that is apparently about to happen. Your gun captain, a compact, dark-haired man called Price, who has been in naval gunnery for 15 years and has the hands and the patience of a craftsman, has positioned you on the train tackle, one of the ropes used to haul the gun back into its firing position after recoil, which is physically demanding and positionally straightforward, requiring strength and timing rather than the more specialized knowledge that other roles demand. You can do this. You grab the tackle and you wait. The enemy ship, French as it turns out, a 64-gun ship that is slightly smaller than yours but not so much smaller as to make the outcome obvious, is close enough now to be read in some detail through the officers' telescopes, and the information filtering down from the quarterdeck through the chain of command suggests that she is not running, that she has cleared for action herself, that this is going to be an engagement rather than a chase. The captain's voice, when it reaches the gun decks as a series of relayed commands, has a quality you have not heard from him before. Not louder, exactly, but more precise, more contained. The voice of a man who has organized himself entirely around the task at hand and from whom everything non-essential has been stripped away. The lieutenants on the gun decks move along their batteries with a calm that you recognize, from your weeks of observing the ship's hierarchy, as genuine rather than performed. The calm of men who have done this before and who have made whatever internal accommodation with the possibility of their own death that allows them to function in its proximity. The noise when the engagement begins is the thing that no description fully prepares you for. You have heard the practice guns, the occasional single shot fired at a floating target to keep the crew sharp, but a broadside is not a scaled-up version of a single shot. It is a different category of experience, a sound so total and so physical that it operates below hearing and above it simultaneously, felt in the chest and the gut and the teeth before it is processed by any cognitive function. The concussion from the guns in your own deck hammers the air out of the space with each shot, and the smoke, the thick, acrid, sulfurous smoke from the black powder charges, fills the gun deck within the first exchange with a speed that reduces visibility to a few feet and turns the space into a gray, choking hell in which men move by memory and training rather than sight. The smell of burned powder is overwhelming, sharp and chemical and ancient, the smell of 1,000 years of warfare distilled into this moment, this deck, this gun. The recoil is also something that practice does not fully simulate. When a 26-pounder fires, it does not merely move. It flings itself backward against the breechings with a violence that, if you are anywhere near the path of recoil and not paying attention, will do to you what several hundred pounds of moving iron inevitably does to a human body that gets in its way. Men were killed and maimed by their own guns' recoil throughout the history of naval artillery, and the choreography of the gun crew is designed as much to keep bodies out of that path as to load and fire efficiently. You haul on the train tackle when Price's hand signals tell you to haul, and the gun comes back into its firing position, and the sequence begins again, and the smoke thickens, and the noise continues, and somewhere on the other side of the gun port there is a French ship doing exactly the same thing in return. What comes back from the French ship arrives as sound first, a rushing, tearing sound that is the passage of round shot through air, arriving faster than any warning is useful, and then as effect, and the effects on the gun deck are immediate and various and none of them good. Round shot passing through the side of a wooden ship does not behave like a bullet passing through a softer material. It does not make a clean hole. It explodes the wood around the point of impact into a storm of splinters, fragments of oak ranging from needle-thin slivers to chunks the size of your arm, that travel outward from the impact at speeds sufficient to penetrate flesh as thoroughly as any purpose-made weapon, and the splinters, not the round shot itself, were responsible for the majority of wounds in a naval engagement of this era. Men were not primarily hit by cannonballs. They were hit by their own ship, converted into shrapnel, and this gave the gun deck in action a particular texture of horror that was intimately connected to the material you were standing in, the wood you were touching, the ship you were trusting. The surgeon's cockpit, remember Fellows's domain, which we visited for a toothache in what now seems like a previous life, has been transformed by the drum beat to quarters into the operating theater it was always structurally prepared to be, with the sea chests converted into operating surfaces and the instruments laid out and the loblolly boys, the surgeon's assistants, stationed and ready. Fellows will work through the engagement and after it with a focus and a speed that the conditions demand, because speed in surgery in this era was not a virtue but a survival mechanism. The longer an operation took, the more blood was lost, the greater the shock, the worse the outcome, and the best surgeons were distinguished less by their diagnostic sophistication than by their ability to amputate a limb in under a minute with a technique that minimized blood loss and maximized the patient's chance of surviving the procedure itself, if not always the subsequent infection. Historians still argue about whether the survival rates for amputations performed at sea in this period were better or worse than those performed ashore, the argument centering on whether the relative isolation of a ship at sea reduced exposure to the environmental pathogens that contributed to post-surgical infection in land hospitals, the paradox being that the appalling conditions of the ship might, in this specific respect, have offered a marginal advantage over the appalling conditions of contemporary land surgery. The answer seems to depend heavily on the specific ship, the specific surgeon, the specific campaign, and the specific quality of the luck available, which is not a satisfying conclusion but is probably an accurate one. The engagement lasts. This engagement, your first, the one you will carry in your body for the rest of whatever life this service allows you, for something between 2 and 3 hours, though your experience of time during it is entirely unreliable. Compressed in some moments and stretched in others, the normal metric of duration replaced by something measured in shots fired and men down and the steadily accumulating weight of the smoke and the noise and the effort. You haul your tackle. You stay out of the recoil path. You do not think about the splinters because thinking about them while in their proximity is not useful, and your brain, which is doing something that you will later recognize as a kind of protective narrowing of focus, is keeping you in the immediate requirements of the next 30 seconds rather than the larger context in which those 30 seconds are occurring. The French ship strikes her colors, lowers her flag in the formal gesture of surrender, in the early afternoon, and the cessation of her fire produces a silence on your gun deck that is so sudden and so total that it has its own quality of shock. A silence that rings with the ghost of the noise that just occupied it and that takes several seconds to process as something other than a pause. Around you, the gun crews stand in various attitudes of exhaustion and relief, gray with powder smoke, sweat-streaked, several of them with the specific emptied expression of men who have been somewhere very loud and very frightening and have come back from it and are not yet sure what to do with the coming back. Price is looking at his gun with the expression of a craftsman checking his work, assessing the barrel for damage, checking the breechings, doing the things that need doing next in the way of a man for whom the doing of the next thing is the mechanism by which he processes everything that just happened. You have 2 men down from your immediate section of the deck. One has a splinter wound in his shoulder that Fellows's loblolly boy has already packed with lint and bound with linen, and he is sitting against the ship's side with the pale, careful stillness of a man managing pain by not moving. The other is not going to require Fellows's attention, for reasons you are not going to examine too closely right now, and he has been moved with a quietness and a practicality that tells you the men of the lower deck have a relationship with death that is not the same as yours, that they have been here before and have learned to carry it without being stopped by it, and that you will learn this too in time whether you want to or not. The prize crew is being organized to take the French ship into the nearest friendly port, and there is already, floating up through the hierarchy from the lower deck, the unspoken but universal calculation of prize money, the financial reward distributed to a ship's company for the capture of an enemy vessel, one of the few genuine financial windfalls available to men of the lower deck, divided according to a formula that gave the captain the largest share and the common sailors the smallest, but that still represented, for a man earning a few shillings a month, something that could matter enormously. The mood on the gun deck, as the smoke slowly clears through the opened ports and the gray afternoon light begins to reclaim the space, is not celebratory exactly, but it is something, a warmth, a collective exhalation, the particular atmosphere of a group of people who have done a hard and dangerous thing together and are still here to notice that they have done it. You lean against the gun carriage, which is still warm from the afternoon's work, and you breathe the clearing air, and you look at your hands, which are black with powder residue on top of the tar stains that were already there, and you think about the French sailors being dealt with by their own surgeons on their own lower deck, and the thought connects you to them in a way that the battle, while it was happening, did not. The thought that the men on the other side of those gun ports were doing exactly what you were doing, hauling the same tackles, breathing the same smoke, and that the outcome was decided by the sum of training and ship quality and luck and the random geometry of where splinters flew, and that it could have gone differently, and that somewhere on the French ship it did go differently, and that the difference between those outcomes and yours is not entirely yours to take credit for. The prize ship is gone, shepherded toward port by a skeleton crew of men who looked quietly relieved to be going anywhere that was not here, and the sea around you is empty again in the way that the sea always returns to empty, as if the battle were a temporary disturbance in something that has no interest in disturbances and prefers its own vast, rolling continuity. The work of repair begins almost before the smoke has fully cleared, because the ship has been damaged in ways that range from cosmetic to serious, and the sea does not suspend its demands while you address your structural injuries. Splinter damage to the hull planking, a topmast carried away by a lucky shot in the second hour of the engagement, rigging cut in a dozen places that will take days of careful work to splice and reeve back to full function. All of this needs attention, and the carpenter and his crew are already moving through the ship with the focused urgency of men who understand that the line between a damaged ship and a sinking one is a matter of degree rather than kind, and that the sea will find any weakness and work it, patiently, until it becomes a larger weakness and then a catastrophe. You are put to work on the rigging repairs, which is where your weeks of line learning finally pay their first real dividend, because you know enough now to be genuinely useful in a way that you were not on your first day. And the ability to identify the correct line and perform the correct action without being walked through it step by step has a value in the aftermath of a battle that your petty officer acknowledges with a nod that, from Grimes, constitutes approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. Your hands work the splice with the new, hardened competence they have been building since Portsmouth, and you feel, for the first time in this voyage, something that is not quite pride but is adjacent to it, the quiet satisfaction of a body that has learned something real and is now using it. The days following the engagement settle into a rhythm that is different in texture from the weeks before it. Something has shifted in the collective atmosphere of the ship, a subtle recalibration that is difficult to name but easy to feel. The men who were in the battle, which is everyone, but especially the gun crews and the top men who worked in the worst of it, carry themselves with a slight but perceptible alteration in their bearing, the way that people carry themselves after having been tested and having passed. Not arrogance exactly, more like a quiet certainty about what they are capable of that was theoretical before and is empirical now. You feel this in yourself too, to your own mild surprise, a groundedness in your own competence that the weeks of struggle and confusion had not yet produced and that the battle, strangely, has. The ship makes for a friendly port for resupply and repairs, and the approach to land, after weeks at sea, produces in the ship's company a transformation in mood that is immediate and almost comical in its visibility. Men who have been maintaining the stoic, economical, emotional register of professional sailors for a month suddenly develop opinions about personal appearance, examining their shore clothing with a critical eye and borrowing soap with an enthusiasm that would have seemed excessive 3 days earlier. Ned produces a small mirror from his wooden box, a piece of equipment whose existence you had not suspected in a man who seemed to have reduced his material needs to their absolute minimum, and conducts a facial assessment with the serious attention of someone preparing for an important appointment. The lower deck smells slightly more of soap than usual, which is an improvement that your nose appreciates with genuine gratitude. Shore leave in a port town of the mid-18th century was a compressed, urgent, sometimes chaotic experience of everything. The ship was not noise of a different kind, color after weeks of gray water and gray sky and the limited palette of tar and oak and canvas, the specific and overwhelming pleasure of ground that did not move under your feet, which turns out to be something your body has missed with a physical longing you had not consciously registered until the moment you step off the boat and onto the dock and feel the earth's absolute stillness and almost lose your balance from the shock of it. The sea legs you spent weeks developing have made land feel strange, the world too solid, too fixed, your body still making the automatic compensating movements for a roll that is not coming, and you walk with the characteristic rolling gait of the returned sailor that will take a day or two to resolve. The port town receives sailors with the commercial efficiency of an institution that has been doing so for a very long time and has organized itself accordingly. There are taverns, obviously, and the taverns serve the returning sailors' primary requirements. Alcohol in quantities sufficient to make the past month make sense. Food that is not hardtack and salt beef. And human company that is not the same 500 faces you have been looking at since Portsmouth. The rum is cheap and strong, and your tolerance for it, having been calibrated by the daily grog ration, is higher than it was before you came aboard, but still lower than you will, after the fashion of the lower deck, somewhat overestimate. Ned drinks with the methodical precision of a man who has a personal policy about how drunk he is prepared to become and intends to honor it, and you try to match his pace and succeed for approximately the first 2 hours. The food in the dockside tavern deserves a paragraph entirely its own. It is not objectively remarkable food. It is simple port town cooking, bread and meat and something in a sauce and a piece of fruit tart that is more pastry than fruit. But you eat it with the speechless, full-body gratitude of a man who has been eating hardtack and salt beef for a month. And every mouthful is an event. The bread is soft. This detail alone, the simple softness of fresh bread, occupies your attention with an intensity that would seem absurd in any other context, and that in this one is entirely proportionate. You eat slowly, chewing with the deliberate appreciation of someone who has learned, in the most direct possible way, what food means when you have been without good food. And the tavern keeper watches you with the expression of a man who has seen sailors come off ships many times and knows exactly what this looks like. The superstitions of the lower deck, which have been accumulating in your awareness since you came aboard but which you have not had time to examine properly, are in full evidence during the shore leave and the days around it. Sailors in this period maintained a relationship with superstition that was elaborate, internally consistent, and held with a seriousness that occupied the space somewhere between genuine belief and practical cultural convention, the kind of thing where a man might not be entirely certain he believed the taboo but was absolutely certain he was not going to violate it and find out. Whistling aboard ship was forbidden because whistling was believed to summon the wind, which was the kind of outcome you wanted to control rather than accidentally invoke. Women aboard ship were considered bad luck by some, absolutely fine by others, the disagreement running along ship-specific and individual lines without any resolution. Certain words were not to be spoken aboard, rabbits, for reasons that remain genuinely obscure and that historians of maritime folklore have not fully resolved. Was on some ships a word of such profound ill omen that a sailor who accidentally said it was required to perform a specific counter-ritual to neutralize the damage. You ask Ned about this on the dock in a moment of genuine curiosity, and he looks at you with an expression that suggests this is not a joke and is not a topic for casual inquiry, and then he changes the subject. The folklore that bound the lower deck together was not merely about taboos and prohibitions. It was also a living body of navigational and environmental knowledge, accumulated over generations of seafaring and transmitted orally in the form of rhymes and sayings and pattern recognition rules that encoded real meteorological and maritime intelligence in memorable form. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight, or sailor's delight, in the maritime version, encoded a genuine observation about the relationship between evening sky color and weather patterns that has a real meteorological basis. The behavior of seabirds, the color of the water, the smell of the air, the shape of clouds at specific times of day. All of these were read by experienced sailors as a continuous environmental text, and the men who could read it most fluently were valued for that skill in ways that formal education was not required to produce. The ship's company also maintained a rich tradition of more formal narrative, the sea story, which was the primary entertainment technology of the lower deck and which had developed over centuries into a sophisticated genre with its own conventions and its own stars. The best storytellers on a ship were known and sought out, their stories requested by name on long evenings in port or during the quiet watches of a calm night at sea. And the stories themselves ranged from straightforward accounts of previous voyages and engagements to elaborately embroidered narratives that accumulated details with each retelling until the line between memory and mythology was thoroughly blurred. Ned, it turns out, is one of these, a storyteller of genuine ability with a narrative instinct that knows when to slow down and when to accelerate, when to lower his voice for effect and when to let a detail sit in silence for a moment before moving on. You listen to him one evening in port, in the tavern, telling a story about a voyage to the Caribbean in 1739 that involved a hurricane, a French privateer, a captured parrot that could apparently swear in 4 languages, and an outcome that stretched plausibility so comprehensively that it was either completely true or a masterpiece of fiction. And in the candlelight and the rum warmth of the tavern with the other men leaning in, it does not matter which. The return to the ship after shore leave has a quality that is not entirely unlike the first boarding, except that the ship you are returning to is a known quantity now, a place rather than a concept, and the men you are boarding with are not strangers but something more than strangers, something that the shared weeks at sea and the battle and the storm have created that does not have a precise civilian name. Not friends exactly, not in the way that word is used ashore, not chosen companions whose company you have selected from a range of options. More like the people you have been through something with, which is a different and in some ways more durable category of human connection. One that does not require you to particularly like each other and does not dissolve when circumstances change. You walk up the gangplank behind Ned and behind the others, and the ship receives you back with its smell and its sounds and its particular quality of enclosed, creaking, slightly damp familiarity, and you discover that somewhere in the past weeks it has become, in some qualified and complicated sense, home. The voyage continues. There will be more weeks at sea, more storms, probably more engagements. The steady accumulated weight of the months adding their increments to the transformation that began the moment you stepped aboard in Portsmouth. The hardtack will not improve. The Weevils will maintain their presence with undiminished enthusiasm. The watch system will continue its remorseless 4-hour rotation. The bell marking time with a regularity that eventually gets under the skin in a way that makes you feel its absence more acutely than its presence. But you move through all of it differently now, with a competence that is real rather than aspirational and a knowledge of what this life costs that is no longer theoretical. The tooth, which fellows finally removed in port in an experience that you are not going to describe in detail because you would like everyone here to be able to sleep, is gone. And the absence of its infection is a physical relief so significant that it briefly makes everything else seem manageable. The men of the lower deck, these 500 or so human beings packed into their oak and canvas world, were not the broken, brutalized, faceless mass that some histories imply and that the distance of 3 centuries can make them seem. They were men with names and stories and skills and relationships and superstitions and a dark humor about their situation that was one of the most sophisticated adaptive mechanisms available to them. They endured conditions that would be unrecognizable as a working environment by any standard we apply today, and they did it without the language of rights or the infrastructure of advocacy or any expectation that the conditions were improvable, and yet they also sang and danced and told stories and carved decorative objects from salt beef and maintained, in the teeth of everything the 18th century could throw at them, the irreducible human tendency to find something worth smiling about. You will not last a day on this ship, not in the sense of arriving unscathed and comfortable, not in the sense of finding it easy or acceptable or anything but profoundly, comprehensively difficult. But you would, if you were given no choice, adapt. That is what the history tells us. That people adapt. That the human body and the human mind, given no alternative, will find the capacity for things that seem impossible from the outside, will build calluses where they need calluses and patience where they need patience, will locate humor in situations that seem to offer none and connection in environments that seem designed to prevent it. The men of the lower deck did this every day for years in one of the most demanding environments in the history of human labor, and they left behind them a maritime tradition that shaped the modern world in ways still visible if you know where to look. And now, as the ship finds her rhythm again in the open water beyond the harbor, and the land falls away behind you for the second time, it is time to let the story ease toward its quiet close. The gun deck is settling for the evening, the lanterns lit, the smell of tallow and tar threading through the familiar darkness below. Around you, men are folding into their hammocks with that absolute, boneless surrender that you have finally learned yourself, bodies releasing the day's labor into the canvas and the gentle sway of the ship's motion. The bell strikes, soft and regular, counting down the hours to nothing in particular, just the next hour, and the one after that, the ocean vast and dark and breathing outside the oak planking that is the only thing between all of you and its enormity. Let the sounds of the ship come to you now. The deep, slow creak of the timbers, like the breathing of something enormous and patient, like the sound of old wood settling into itself after a long day. Let the motion take you, that gentle, endless rocking that the hammock translates into something almost tender, the sea enormous and unknowing beneath you, but the hammock small and close in yours. The men around you sleep the heavy sleep of people who have worked and will work again, and the ship moves through the night water with its quiet, purposeful breathing, and the stars above the deck, if you could see them from here, would be extraordinary, horizon to horizon, uncountable. The sky that these men navigated by and told time by and wondered at, the same sky that is above you right now, wherever you are in the world tonight. Let your own breathing slow to match the ship's rhythm. Let the stories of these men settle into something soft and distant, the hardtack and the weevils and the splinters and the bell all fading to a comfortable historical distance, becoming the interesting past rather than the immediate present, the kind of thing you know about now rather than the thing that is happening to you. You are warm. You are still. The ground beneath you does not move. These are things worth noticing, worth being quietly grateful for. As you close your eyes, the ship sails on into its own dark ocean, carrying its 500 souls toward whatever the 18th century has waiting for them, and you are not among them anymore. You are here in your own time, in your own warmth, in the enormous luxury of your own bed, which you have perhaps never appreciated quite so specifically as you do right now. The bell counts its quiet strokes. The timbers breathe. The sea receives the night. Sleep well.